Welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here. I'm so glad you're here for Spy Chat with our Executive Director, Chris Costa. Chris should need no introduction, but for the record, he is a former intelligence officer of 34 years, with 25 of those in active duty hotspots such as Panama, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He's also a past special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism on the National Security Council. And today, Chris is joined by Karen Schaefer, who's an advisory board member here. During Karen's 26-year career with the CIA, she held numerous leadership positions, including overseas assignments as an operations officer in Latin America, Europe, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Her headquarters positions included Chief of Operations, Directorate of Science and Technology, Deputy Associate Director of Military Affairs, Deputy Chief of Counterintelligence, Near East Division, Executive Assistant to Deputy Director CIA, and Group Chief, Iran Operations Division. I know that Karen and Chris worked together in the past. We may never know exactly how or where, but they do share some past, which will be interesting if they'll touch upon that at all today. I don't know. Anyway, needless to say, we have some very informed perspectives on current issues up here on the stage. Now, we'll begin with some brief comments from both Chris and Karen, and then we'll open the floor up to your questions. We have microphones on either side of the stage. Please use those so everyone can hear, and we also record this, so we want to really hear your questions. And if anyone can't make it, if you're trapped in an unforgiving row, I'll be looking around and I can bring a mic to you. Now, before I hand this over to Chris and Karen, some of you may be carrying spy devices with you that make noises or go off to alert you. Please silence those gadgets. We'd really appreciate it. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming today and joining Karen and I for this program. First of all, I want to say one of my significant accomplishments in the last 2 years is convincing Karen to come to the Spy Museum to join our board of advisors and participate in this program. So I'm really excited to have Karen here. So this is really your program. So this is going to be driven by your questions. So what I thought I would do, and this is our second iteration, we're still learning, what I thought I would do is just share some news articles, just some headlines, some top lines, if you will, of issues that I'm tracking that I think are very, very relevant for national security. And then we will invite questions. You can ask us about some of the areas we cover, or you can go off script because there is none, and ask us anything you want. And to the extent we can, we will try to ask if it's related to national security or spying. So the first story that I'm tracking this month that I think is really important reads like this: how the CIA used Crypto AG, which is a Swiss company, encryption devices to spy on countries for decades. It's a very important story of a long-term operation that, to be frank, I had no awareness of. It was likely deeply sensitive. The idea that the CIA and the Germans, the German Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, had control of a Swiss company, Neutral Switzerland, and basically sold encryption devices to over 120 countries across the world. And then we spied on them. We had access to their secrets while they used encryption devices provided by the CIA. Of course, they didn't know that. Many of them didn't know that probably until last week when the Washington Post story broke. It's a fascinating story of a long-term CIA operation that I think is very important, and to recognize that we did this operation with the Germans from roughly post-World War II for 50 years. So that's a story I found interesting. Another story related to just pure espionage is this idea that the Danes, Denmark Security Services, arrested some Iranian opposition groups suspected of spying for the Saudis. So we're talking about an opposition movement from Iran. They're Khuzestani Arabs, so they're from a population that is roughly anti-Iran in their temperament and their experience, and the bottom line is they were going to spy on Iranians in Denmark. I think that's an interesting story. In our last segment, we talked about another Iranian opposition group. Another story that I think is really important, and I think we're likely going to take some questions from the audience on China, right? And a couple things have happened in the last 24 hours that I'm tracking. 5 media companies that are associated with the Chinese government media platforms were essentially declared Chinese government actors for all intents and purposes, which means they're no longer considered just journalistic outlets, and they're going to be treated like government entities. And I think what the United States is trying to do with that is essentially develop some reciprocity where we treat the Chinese the way they treat us in China. So this is just one aspect of leveling the playing field a little bit, because these journalists are very much aligned to Chinese Communist Party interests. So I found that a fascinating story, and along with that, you might have noted that some Wall Street Journal journalists were thrown out of China in the last 24 hours or so, and that's a result of what? Probably the actions taken by the United States government. And add another China story that's very important, and that's this company called Equifax, I think that's how you pronounce it, in 2017 was hacked by the Chinese military. And that also is a very important subject to all Americans, because millions of Americans, their private information was accessed by these Chinese hackers that belong to a military organization. I believe there were 4 of them that were named. And that means there's a ratcheting of counterintelligence activities appropriately directed against Chinese military and intelligence entities. So I'll stop there on counterintelligence stories, because I think we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Just running forward with some terrorist stories that I think are very important for us to talk about possibly, is there was a strike, a drone strike, I believe, was directed against al-Rimi in Yemen, right? And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, if you remember, in the last few years, they have tried to develop capabilities to bring down aircrafts. And all of that work with Western intelligence services and U.S. special operations and foreign partners has really kept Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula on the run. And I think that is a good news story, because this is a terrorist organization that wants to bring down airlines, commercial airlines, and kill innocent people. I think that's a significant blow to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And I should note that Ryan Owens, a SEAL in 2017, was killed on an intelligence raid. We knew Ryan, we knew who he was. I was at the White House when the decision was made to conduct a raid against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So very lethal actors, they're on their heels. Additionally, there's a really long piece I would just flag for this audience. Not something we'll talk about at any length, but an interesting piece was published about how states, nations decide to strike people, how they decide to take direct action against terrorist targets like al-Rimi. It was in the New Yorker, and it's a very long piece, but it talks about Qasem Soleimani, who we talked about last month, who was head of essentially Iranian Quds forces, proxy forces. I think it's an interesting story, but it linked it to other decisions other countries have reportedly made for strikes. In moving forward, and then I'll wrap up, there was another citizen, U.S. citizen, kidnapped in Afghanistan. This is important because the United States and Western partners, we track hostages, we try to recover those hostages. The fact that it happened while we're in the midst of possibly peace and reconciliation, and there's an American from Illinois that has a family that is now being held by the Taliban or one of their proxies in Afghanistan is an important story that sometimes gets missed. And I guess I'll close out by saying another interesting big picture national security issue that I am watching very closely is the president, I think, is planning on going to India. And what's important about that is we talked about China, and I think Karen has some things to say about China, and we also will invite questions from you. But by developing a stronger relationship with India that provides as a counterbalance, I think, to some of China's efforts globally. And you'll note that this week, Secretary of State Pompeo is in Africa doing the same thing, trying to counter some of China's influence and really make sure some of our soft power becomes more aligned with some of our African partners. So those are the stories that I'm watching. As I said, when it's time for questions, we'll answer whatever we can. Thank you, Karen.
Hi, Chris. First of all, thanks for inviting me to be here. He really didn't have to twist my arm too much. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I was fortunate enough to work with the agency for 26 years. I loved it. I think it's a fabulous career. I'm happy to talk to anybody if you're interested in pursuing a career in either the agency or the FBI. And it's a way that I can continue to give back to the community. I also have to laugh because this morning as I was walking out the door, I said to my 5-year-old son, I said, "Hey, will you wish me luck? I'm going to do this talk." And he said, "Mom, I'm sure you're going to have a great speech. Just make sure you win." I was like, zero-sum game, all right. So you're on notice, Chris.
All
I'm
right.
going to win.
All right, you got it.
Chris asked me to share some thoughts on what I was tracking this month, and I have to say, it is, to use the word you used last time around, there are a dizzying number of national security stories in the news on any given day. But I just decided to focus on a couple that I thought were particularly pertinent. But I wanted to start before I got into those, just to frame a little bit of what I think allows you to understand a bit more how we approach the national security threat by highlighting the newest National Counterintelligence Strategy. This was something that was just published on the 10th of February by the NCSC, which is the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, and they published it. It was just signed by the president in January, and it's the first one that's been written since 2016, and I can't begin to tell you how much our approach to counterintelligence has changed just within the scope of those years because the threats have evolved so dramatically. And in the past, what we would do is we would address counterintelligence through the lens of nation-state actors. And clearly, we're still most concerned about those nation-state actors, most of whom you probably would recognize, the China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Cubas of the world. But what they've done smartly, I think, is understood that we really have to step back a little and take a much more strategic approach. And so what they did this go around was frame it in the context of priorities and goals for the strategy. So I thought it would be useful just to tick through them very quickly because it will be important, I think, as we talk about most of the issues that you all are likely to raise, that you'll see how they fall within the context of almost every one of these priorities and objectives that have been laid out by the DNI. So the first one is critical infrastructure. The goal here, obviously, is to protect the U.S. government's critical infrastructure from exploitation, disruption, or degradation from foreign actors. Pretty simple and straightforward. Not quite so simple and straightforward because how do you define what critical infrastructure is? And it is something that we as an intelligence community struggle with mightily. And you'll see as we talk about some of the threats that we've been facing, it's not just things that might seem obvious like physical infrastructure, but then it's things like supply chain. It's things like how do we have access to pharmaceuticals in time of need. So it's really interesting and well beyond the scope of what you might first consider. Second piece is key supply chains. Again, here the goal is more from a defensive perspective, and it's focused on preventing foreign efforts to seed in either products or services that could compromise the integrity of the U.S. government or the defense establishment's capabilities inside the United States in particular, but also in our installations overseas. The third one is focused on the U.S. economy. No surprise to you all, one of the biggest threats to our national security is undermining the competitive advantage that we have in the world and our economic prosperity. We see a lot of underhanded efforts by the Chinese in particular to steal intellectual property. So a lot of this is focused on making sure that we're doing whatever we can to ensure that the U.S. maintains its innovative advantage in the world economy. The next one would be American democratic institutions. Again, this probably won't surprise you if you've been watching the news and following anything for the last couple of years. Since the previous election, a lot of focus in particular on the Russians and their impact and their meddling in the last presidential election. But as a lot of my friends here from the FBI can testify to, we're not just concerned about the Russians. We know that the Chinese, the Iranians, other key state actors watch the success that the Russians have had and are looking to emulate that for their own purposes. So this is something that goes well beyond the scope of just the Russian foreign covert influence operations and direct intervention into the previous election. And then the last one is cyber and technical operations, and this again is to counter foreign intelligence efforts to conduct cyber and technical operations. As you can imagine, with the Internet of Things exploding, with the advent of 5G, their ability to access and potentially compromise or either collect or sabotage our capabilities are extraordinary, and it's something that we are very seized with, and you'll hear a lot about this in the discussion. I think it's certainly why the things that keep me awake at night almost all revolve around China, simply because they are such an overwhelming force in just about every aspect and impact just about every aspect of our national security. So I'll transition away from that. I think what I will say, just a couple of things that are noteworthy about this new counterintelligence strategy. Not only, as I mentioned before, the move away from nation-state actors, but also really a recognition on the part of Bill Evanina, who is the director of the NCSC, came out and said, hey, look, what we've recognized is that given so much of the focus of our foreign intelligence actors is not simply against the U.S. as a state, but against our private enterprise, that this is really going to take a whole of government, a whole of society to be able to push back on these threats. In particular, working closely with the private sector and the American public, who are often going to be aware of efforts to target us well before the U.S. government might even be aware. So switching gears, as I said, I feel like China for me is what keeps me awake at night. A couple things that I wanted to highlight, there's a whole host of them, but I'll dovetail off of what Chris said. Coronavirus. I think everybody should be supremely concerned about the coronavirus. I think there's been a lot of interesting articles written about this over the last couple of months. Certainly the threat to human life is paramount, and it's devastating. It's already taken over 1,000 lives, and I suspect that's likely underreported by the Chinese government, as they are wont to do. I also think it demonstrates the vulnerability of a top-down government in the Chinese, the way that the Communist Party runs the government. Unfortunately, giving bad news is not always a good thing, and it is not always something that's rewarded. As you saw, the one doctor that tried to speak out and warn about the virus and its potential implications was very quickly apprehended, disciplined, and ultimately, very tragically, died and has become somewhat of a hero for some of the pockets of resistance inside China. So it's not something that's rewarded, which has tremendous impact. This is an epidemic which likely could have been arrested much earlier in the process and infected a lot less people had the Chinese government known about it and been able to address it more effectively sooner. But what interests me in particular about this, and Chris and I were chatting about this, beyond that is really a piece that I had not focused on, but I read a fascinating article. There's a scientist and policymaker, a Scowcroft Institute Pandemic and Biosecurity Policy Program base at the Bush School of Texas A&M. And they wrote this fascinating piece talking about the impacts of pandemics writ large, but obviously talking specifically as it relates to this one. And what their point was that China presents not just in the context of the spread of this virus, but in the context of the fact that that they are the largest and sometimes only supplier of most active ingredients in vital medications. Right now, they account for 80% of the pharmaceuticals that are used inside the United States. That's just the pharmaceuticals. In addition to that, there's the medical equipment, which they primarily produce. And in this piece, these folks at Texas A&M were raising the alarm bell saying, hey, look, for us to be able to backfill, were the Chinese ever to determine that they could no longer support the needs outside of their own country, which are clearly significant, there would be no backup plan for the rest of the world, and certainly not for the United States. And their estimate was that it would take at least several years to reconstitute some of the infrastructure necessary to be able to provide basic pharmaceutical support, medical equipment for the needs and services of the United States people. So it's something for you to think about. It's certainly something that hadn't struck me initially, but in the context of supply chain, infrastructure, things like that, the more dependent we become on a country like China, the more vulnerable we are to them in times of crisis. I wanted to touch a little bit on Huawei, also a huge topic. Huawei, there was a big push, as you probably saw in the news, the Trump administration pushing very, very hard, as previous administrations, to convince, in particular, our NATO allies not to allow Huawei to be integrated into their national infrastructure and telecommunications. There was just reports out last week that the Brits made a decision to go ahead and allow the use of Huawei. This was a huge blow for the United States government because we had lobbied very hard, particularly with the UK. It sends a really important signal in my mind, not just regarding the nature of our partnership with the UK and the limits of that partnership, but it also sends a message to other countries which may be considering the integration of Huawei into their communications infrastructure. The challenge becomes that the United States government, the intel community, is fairly certain that Huawei is a willing partner of the Communist Party, and that there are back doors that are available that would be used as necessary to provide information to the Communist Party. So this potentially serves as a huge counterintelligence threat because we rely on collaborating with these partners. The UK is one of our most important intel partners. Therefore, if their communications are suspect, it makes it difficult for us to effectively share intelligence and be assured that that intelligence is being safeguarded. So there are implications, there's ripple effects to all of these sort of decisions. So very, in my estimation, very damaging. We will find ways to continue to work with these partners because we don't have an alternative, but there are certainly going to be counterintelligence complications as a result of this decision by the UK, and I suspect it will also reinforce the decisions others are considering taking, other partners that we have, to include the Germans, who haven't really come down yet definitively on how they are or not going to integrate Huawei. I also wanted to mention just yesterday, the DOJ FBI charged Huawei and two of its subsidiaries with federal racketeering and conspiracy to steal trade secrets from American companies. So again, we're seeing repetition, constant evidence of the Chinese using tactics to either steal or coerce information, intelligence, intellectual property from some of our most important U.S. companies. You already touched on Equifax, so I'll skip over that one. And you also talked about the communist state and the mention of the Chinese official media. I do think what you're seeing is a pretty important series of steps that the administration is taking to take a harder line against China. The question will be, are we able to sustain this, and to what effect? Because then I also saw yesterday that the president had made some tweets suggesting that we might be rolling back some of the restrictions on providing certain sensitive equipment to China. So I think there's probably a lot more to that story. I would simply say that the intelligence community is smartly concerned about the impact of the Chinese influence in just about every sector of the economy, and that if we don't get a handle on this now, that we will find ourselves in much dire straits, not the least of which is the example of the pharmaceuticals. Let's see. One last thing I did want to touch on before we can open it up to questions, and this is something that I didn't pay a lot of attention to. My last assignment was over at the FBI. I was our senior representative to their 7th floor, to their leadership team, and one of the things that they are highly focused on right now is domestic terrorism. And you all may have read in January, there were 7 individuals affiliated with an organization called the Base, which ironically is the same name as Al-Qaeda translated, a white supremacist group that were trying to enter the United States from Canada. The FBI arrested them. They were planning on attending the rally in Richmond for gun control gun rights in Richmond. What's interesting about this story to me are a couple of things. Number one, I think the fact that you're starting to see sort of a coalition of international ties to this new domestic terrorism. It's not simply a domestic terrorism problem, but the white sort of race-based nationalistic threat that we're seeing increasingly across the world. You're seeing these international ties, which I think are really important to understand. I was also shocked because I was reading a report by CSIS that noted that since 9/11, 110 people in the United States have been killed by domestic terrorists, whereas only 107 have been killed by what we would refer to as jihadist attacks, which is pretty striking and something which demonstrates the growing threat of this domestic terrorism. And I also think it's important because U.S. law has not caught up to this threat. In many instances, FBI and local law enforcement are really stymied in their efforts to effectively go after domestic terrorists inside the United States. There's a big push to try to seek for what we consider called foreign terrorist organization designations, which would allow our law enforcement a lot greater latitude to be able to go after these organizations. It would allow them to to monitor communications between people that are designated in these groups, share intelligence about these groups with our allies overseas, and bring material support charges against some of these folks. But right now, none of those tools exist to directly address the threat of domestic terrorism. So it's something that, in my mind, is becoming, as you start to see the rise of nationalism, not just in the United States, but in other countries, it's really something I think we're going to have to get a handle on. You always want to be able to respect free speech and the rights of the private citizens, but not at the expense of national security. And so finding that, threading that needle and finding the right lane to walk becomes really important. So I'll stop there. There's plenty of other stuff.
Thanks,
Chris,
Karen.
Chris mentioned Minerva Project. We can also talk about the new DNI
Right.
interim that was just tapped, as well as there's an interesting report about a Russian dissident that was found dead in
Germany?
in a French, in
Oh, the French.
in the French hotel room. Yeah.
There was also a Chechen not too long ago killed in
that's-
Berlin, right?
Oh, okay. I thought
Yeah.
he was in France. So
It's hard
anyway.
to keep track.
Yes, it is.
Another right-wing attack yesterday in Germany, too. Haven't
Right.
even rolled
Yep.
through a lot of that story. We can dive deep on anything you want to dive deep on, to include that last category of discussion, the idea of right-wing terrorism, work, the policy pieces at the White House, and at least one person that will not go recognized in this room worked on those issues with me at the White House, so we can talk about that or anything else you're interested. This is really your program, driven by your questions. So I'll turn it back to Amanda to gather up questions that you might have.
Well,
Thanks for that, Karen.
I was going to ask about, the first question I was going to ask about the newly appointed acting director of intelligence and maybe his anti-intelligence approach, and how you all feel about that, and then turn it over to this lovely lady who's actually following directions and going to the mic.
So
nuance.
I'll just jump in there, and then I'll let
Yeah.
Karen offer her opinion. The bottom line is, whoever goes into the role of the Director of National Intelligence has to be apolitical. That role, so whatever his or her current position is, whoever has made the acting, and it appears to be the ambassador to Germany is going to be appointed in an acting role, and Admiral McGuire, who I should mention, I think has done an extraordinary good job as an acting in a really tough environment. I've got a lot of respect for him, and Karen and I both know him, but just looking at it objectively, in my perch here at the Spy Museum, I think he's done a very, very good job, but he's in an acting role. The next DNI designee, if he's in an acting role, he has to first and foremost be brutally apolitical, because that's what the community needs. It is not a political position. And fighting off politicization of intelligence is a constant charge for anybody that serves the intelligence community. So that's not to say that a former ambassador cannot step into that role and do a wonderful job. As a matter of fact, Director Coates, former DNI, who left making that vacancy in acting, he also served as the ambassador to Germany, I believe, and did a pretty good job, I think, in the last few years. So it's critical that whoever is in that role changes their behavior to ensure that they are apolitical. That's what the community demands. Certainly being a customer as an ambassador of intelligence and working with presumably a chief of station and the FBI, the legal attaches overseas, that's going to give an ambassador a lot of experience, albeit maybe one posting for this particular designee. So I just think we have to wait and see. Acting is a tough role too. I would like to see down the line, I would like to see a final confirmation for a permanent DNI. I think the community longs for that as well.
I would echo that. I think it's paramount that we have a permanent DNI approved by the Senate as quickly as possible. I would also say that, my experience has been, I worked for 26 years under a myriad of different administrations, Republican and Democrat, and I can honestly say, having worked both at the agency very closely with DoD partners as well as FBI, I very rarely, if ever, saw the political bias that is spoken of so often in the media. I just simply didn't see it. I know that what got me out of bed every morning as a CIA officer was the mission. It was about making sure that I was collecting the best intelligence to allow policymakers to make informed decisions about how this country should address its national security threats. And I would argue that just about all of my colleagues in any embassy that I served, that was what motivated them. And furthermore, being back here in Washington, that was what motivated most of the folks that I worked with, to include even down at the NSC, despite the fact that the NSC by its very nature tends to be a bit more politicized. I would also say that, like Chris, I think we owe the president his due. He has every right to choose whomever he would like to serve as his DNI rep, and the onus is on the intelligence community. The onus is on those members of the DNIs under his portfolio to educate him about the importance of the missions that each organization prosecutes in support of national security. I can tell you that I spent some time as an EA up on our 7th floor at the agency, and I remember at the time Director Panetta was the DCIA, and I remember him joking one time that, and he was clearly had been in Clinton's administration, was very politically savvy. He was chosen because of his political connections, and he came in and joked about how he, in very short order was assimilated, and that he learned to appreciate the role of the agency, and that he understood the importance, and that very quickly he understood that he had to leave his partisan positions at the door, and that he then had to look at national security as the holistic challenge that it is. And so my sense is that if we do our jobs right, if we endeavor to ensure that this new ambassador, at a minimum, is briefed and provided information, then we've done our jobs. At the end of the day, that's as much as can be asked of, and we can only hope that he will take the role very seriously, and as you said, Chris, will understand how critical it will be to help depoliticize the national security. Should be the one sacred cow. Unfortunately, it no longer is, but it should be. It should be in everybody's interest, whether you're Democrat or a Republican, to ensure that our president and the administration and the policymakers are getting intelligence to the best of our, finished intelligence that, to the best of our ability, portrays the facts, and that is it.
Well said. What other questions do we have?
Thank you so much. If I may, I'd like to ask you to comment on two topics. The first one is, of course, would you elaborate on the alt-right, the domestic terrorism issue, the policies, as well as the international connection? The second one is, I think it was last week, there was a report about ISIS killing some Taliban individuals in Afghanistan. Obviously, there are quite a few ISIS individuals everywhere, in Iraq, in Syria, Afghanistan, etc. Could you comment on the likelihood of a resurgence, albeit watered down, but your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, thank you very much. Those are two great questions and very different, right? So let me take the point on ISIS. So ISIS are a natural enemy to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the last count from open sources that I looked at, and I spoke about this at an event not too long ago on Afghanistan and the future counterterrorism threat. We're talking about ISIS operators, hardcore terrorists in the hundreds, and the Taliban is going to continue to put pressure on them. The real problem is whether, with peace and reconciliation, some Taliban are not satisfied with whatever agreement we end up with and migrate to ISIS and become a super something different maybe, but another ISIS-like organization. So that's a concern. But I want you to know it's my opinion that the intelligence community, along with policymakers, are going to be very much zeroed in on making sure that whatever agreements are made, that there are opportunities to continue to put pressure on that and force the right actors to make sure ISIS does not resurge. But it's going to happen globally because there are pieces of ISIS that, not to be alarmist, but they're going to operate. They're growing in West Africa in particular, in the Sahel and the African continent. So it just needs to be arrested like a disease and constant intelligence sharing, and in some cases direct action. But that takes us a little bit away from your question on Afghanistan. That's how I would address ISIS in Afghanistan. It's not a significant problem today, but it could grow in time. In the second point, I'll be very brief.
If I could just add.
Yeah,
just
yeah,
very
go ahead,
quick, I
Karen.
would say, there has been some concern expressed that with the drawdown of one part of the peace agreement with the Taliban, if it goes forward, assuming this 7-day ceasefire persists and we are able to get to a point where all parties agree, if that were enacted, the U.S. government has retained the ability to continue to do force protection operations inside of Afghanistan as well as counterterrorism. So it'll be a reduced footprint. It'll be primarily special operations folks on the ground doing CT. But as we've seen in places like Syria, it doesn't necessarily take a huge footprint. It takes the right footprint of military officers to be able to affect the kind of operations in partnership with the locals on the ground to be able to make sure that they are keeping the ISIS, SKK, in check. So I agree with Chris. I think the much bigger concern right now, particularly as we are starting to hear rumors about a significant drawdown in Africa. Former Admiral Stavridis wrote a great op-ed that I highly recommend to you all. It was a fantastic op-ed about the implications of downsizing our footprint in Africa, and one of his concerns was precisely the fact that you were seeing this growth of terrorist factions, whether it's Al-Shabaab, whether it's Boko Haram, whether it is, AQ in the Western Sahel, that are on the rise at the very time that the U.S. might be stepping out of that theater. So I would agree with that.
That's putting a finer point on it. So that's your first question. Your second question, and Karen did a great job of talking about domestic terrorism and some of the things policymakers and the communities thinking about. I was at the White House when Charlottesville happened. It was a hate crime. There's always this idea then reemerges of an argument for making domestic terrorism more encompassing, maybe more precision in the language, material support to terrorism. What does that mean in terms of domestic U.S.-based organizations? That is a hard problem, as Karen got to, because of First Amendment. My feeling, what First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, when do they become, when do they cross over from somebody that's angry and has a right to speak to somebody that's going to execute a violent act and is going to mobilize for violence? So the FBI and elements of the Department of Homeland Security are always looking at it very closely. So the good news that I shared last month, and I want to reinforce here, is there are underpinnings of stress on and emphasis on domestic terrorism in the Department of Homeland Security right now. There's a new strategy in the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that we go after those that would target schools, to include mass shootings, as well as domestic groups getting ready to activate. So there is going to be more resources focused on those problems. But they're tough problems, too, because this idea of First Amendment rights and the ability for somebody to voice their opinion. But I think there is momentum to make sure legislation is put in place to better define this thing of domestic terrorism. I was always frustrated in my office, and I think Karen would echo, we have all of these capabilities in the intelligence community, but they weren't always afforded to focus and leverage to focus on domestic terrorism because we don't collect intelligence against U.S. persons generally or routinely without court orders and other mechanisms. So the bottom line is it is a tough problem, but I think we're making some progress. Karen?
I would agree. I think you would hit on everything I would have mentioned.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? This is
Right over
great.
here.
Do you suspect there are any counterintelligence motives behind designating the 5 Chinese media companies as government actors, and why not make them register under FARA?
So that's a sort of mechanical question, and I don't know all the nuance of what comes along with that designation, other than the fact that it's a recognition that they're behaving like the Chinese government. And I want to reinforce this idea of reciprocity. These kinds of strictures are placed on journalists from the West who operate in China and try to do their job. So we're leveling, we being the United States in this case, is leveling the playing field to make sure that we're applying the same due diligence to the Chinese journalists that are behaving more like the government. And I would be willing to bet, I have no evidence to prove this and no inside information, but some of those journalists might be working in an intelligence capacity. We do not do that in the U.S. intelligence community because we are not going to put journalists at risk. But that is a consideration.
I would echo that. I think 2 biggest concerns. Number one is the misinformation piece, which we've talked about at length. It is not simply the Russians that are out doing that, it's the Chinese, and I think there was considerable concern that they were doing that. They were leveraging those various groups to propagate information that probably wasn't, that spun the Chinese narrative in a way that we didn't think was always accurate. So there's the misinformation piece, but absolutely, I like Chris, I'm not going to speak to specific cases, but we absolutely know that in the past, journalist cover has been used to enable Chinese operations, both inside the United States and internationally. So there's no question that there is that aspect of it. So I think this is a legitimate and I would say deliberate move on the part of the administration to lay down yet another marker to tell the Chinese that they can't just operate recklessly inside the United States in particular.
Great question, thank you.
Got one over here.
First, I just want to say a quick note of thanks. Your hard work and sleepless nights help us sleep better, so I appreciate that. My question has to do with Chinese companies and working with Chinese companies like Huawei. Is the worry that Huawei is working tightly with the Communist Party, or that they've developed hardware vulnerabilities that will let the Communist Party and their intelligence services directly access the hardware?
You wanna take
I
that?
think it's a combination of both. I think you have to assume worst-case scenario. If we can hearken back to the Minerva project, as an intelligence officer, I will project that if you're an intelligence organization, you are always going to maximize any opportunity that you have to access, even if it's just initially to collect information on your adversary and perhaps ultimately, as necessary, deploy and use it for sabotage operations. So I think that it's really, it's both aspects that we're concerned about. And I think the challenge, honestly, is that when you look at a company like Huawei, because it's certainly not limited to Huawei, let's be clear. I mean, Huawei is front and center right now because of the communications are just such an easy threat for people to seize on and understand the implications of what that would mean, that, you know, a Chinese company could have access to secure communications, data, et cetera. But it covers the gamut of industry, you know, just about every, with potential national security implications.
But to the degree that
So-
it's physical, that provides an opportunity for us as well,
Absolutely.
because if we can discover it, we can
Right.
expose it, and then our
Absolutely.
allies will see
But by
the-
then, it's too late, right? So that's a big risk to take, which is why the U.S. government is taking a position to, as much as possible, limit the introduction of Huawei equipment. Now, the challenge, of course, becomes, okay, and legitimately, governments like the UK will come back to us and say, great, so what's the alternative to Huawei? And that's a very fair complaint, because right now, by even the estimates of Samsung, Ericsson, these other companies, by their own estimates, Huawei is about 1 to 2 years ahead of them with respect to 5G. So you're talking about a huge delta between capability, and there's simply, for most countries, to include the United States, by the way, where Huawei permeates, I mean, the amount of Huawei equipment that's already inside this country is extraordinary, let alone the information that's been repackaged and sold that we don't even know is Huawei. So it's not a simple black or white question or answer, frankly, because there is no easy solution, and there's been a lot of discussions, hey, do we as a NATO bloc, do we try to create some sort of consortium? Is there some way to push back on the behemoth that is Huawei? And, you know, unfortunately, this is one of the second and third order consequences of a partnership that's starting to fracture, and that in my mind is one of the more significant downsides of the fact that our tight alliance with the Commonwealth in particular, this has a huge impact, because when we can't even rally our own closest allies to recognize, hey, we have a huge threat here, and if we don't bite the bullet now, it's certainly never going to get better.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both for being here and illuminating these important issues. I have a question and a comment. My first comment is, I was just about ready to buy tickets to China to take my family on a touristy trip to China when I first heard a trickling of, well, coronavirus, well, wait a minute, maybe I better not hit that button yet. And of course, the days following that, exponentially, we've got more and more news about the coronavirus. Needless to say, we're not going on our trip in June. Even if we were to go, I was hesitant about bringing my cell phone into China. Not that I have what I view as particularly sensitive information or names in my contact list, but I was wondering, I wonder if I should leave my cell phone, my family and I should leave our cell phones at home, and we're just You know, we're normal people. We don't have any, you know, particularly sensitive information, but you never know. So that's my comment. My question is, you touched on Chinese journalists, Chinese equipment. What about Chinese students? If you were to go through practically any university in the U.S., particularly in the engineering school, particularly in the computer science departments, you will find an overwhelming percentage of students coming from China. I don't know if some go back, some stay. I imagine it's a little bit of both. But there just seems to be in some schools, I would say, from my own experience, almost a disproportionate percentage of Chinese students studying comp sci and other technology areas. I just wondered if you had any insights or comments about the students that come in here and you know, learn from us.
I'll let Karen dive in maybe on the student question, because I heard that some grumblings over there, or rumbles or something. I don't think that was her stomach. But I think she can address that. What I want to do is hit the coronavirus real quick to underscore the point that the Wall Street Journal article, and I hope I'm not mistaken on this because it really broke yesterday, talks about the sick man of Asia, and it was very critical of the Chinese government, how it's handled coronavirus, slow to report, as Karen alluded to. So that underscores a problem with the Chinese Communist Party. You don't want to show your vulnerabilities to the world, especially with what's at stake from an economic standpoint. So we have to be skeptical of what China says. That said, to be fair, on the other side of the spectrum, as I understand it, they've handled this much better than they did with SARS a few years ago. So they've embraced some of that criticism. With respect to cell phones and travel, I just think that every time my kids went to travel in places in the world, I was always ensuring that they received a safety brief from Dad, as well as making sure they understood basic principles of good security practices, even if you're not doing national security work, for awareness and how to take care of your phones. But if you're not talking about classified, if you always accept that somebody might be collecting intelligence on your personal cell phone, then you just go in eyes open, you keep those devices on you to the extent that you can, and you've got to live your life and use those tremendous tools. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I'll let Karen maybe address the student issue, because I think that is important.
Absolutely. I would say, and I think at last count, maybe there were about 800,000 Chinese students in the United States. I might be slightly off. So it's a tremendous number of students coming from China in particular. Not surprisingly, because of their high focus on high tech in their country, a lot of them come and study in some of our best schools, and they also are involved in some of the most sensitive research. Therein lies the problem. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that every student that comes over here poses a threat to the United States, and science, as we know, scientific research demands collaboration among students and amongst countries in order to reach the best possible conclusions. Having said that, we definitely are looking to strike a much better balance. This was one of the top priorities for the FBI. They have done, in my estimation, a remarkable job in the last couple of years of educating, particularly the schools that are involved in very sensitive academic research that involves either high, technology, biomedic research, whatever it is. They've done a great job, I think, of sensitizing those communities to the extent that even some of those academic facilities are self-organizing, so that they're much smarter about how they are managing the potential counterintelligence threat. Again, I want to stress, it is not as if every student that comes over here poses a challenge or a threat to the U.S. government. But we certainly have been, given we are an open society and pride ourselves on that, we have not taken the right measures. And I think not this time, but last time, I think you alluded to the fact that, you know, there was just a senior research chairman of the
Right.
research department at Harvard that was arrested for taking money from the Chinese and not disclosing it to Harvard or to DOD. And this has implications because, of course, it allows access to some of our most sensitive research facilities. So I think absolutely huge challenge to get our arms around. The good news, I think, is that there is absolutely a strong effort on the part of FBI in particular to address it. And I think, as I said, in my estimation, just even in the last couple of years that I was watching the evolution there is a new recognition, and you're seeing that even with the arrests of some of these visiting scientists, visiting students, that we are getting a better handle on when they in fact are involved in things that they should not be involved in.
Okay, I
Thank you.
think we have time for one last question.
Good afternoon. My question has to do with addressing the rising threat of right-wing organizations. Just wanted your further thoughts on the impact of the work of FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies with President Trump and his administration, which on the surface level looks like there's a political allegiance with some of these groups, you know, amplifying conspiracy theories, demonizing the FBI and other law enforcement organizations. How does that impact the work of addressing that threat? And also your thoughts on infiltration of the FBI and the military by members of these groups.
So I'll just jump in there, and that's a very good question. The bottom line is that goes right back to what we talked about, the First Amendment issues. You can be outspoken against the FBI wrongly or the CIA. You can sow bad information, disinformation, misinformation. At the end of the day, that doesn't break laws generally. So yeah, we all think that hate speech should be tamped down across the board. And I think every time there's an attack and somebody's inspired by maybe something any politician says at a local level or elsewhere, if somebody's inspired to act based on that, there is more discourse on tamping down harmful rhetoric. But at the end of the day, that's not illegal. The people that are mobilizing for violence are the ones that the FBI wants to bottle up, the Department of Homeland Security, and local and federal, state law enforcement. I worry about the local law enforcement guy pulling over that anti-government individual on a highway routinely at a traffic stop. That is a significant vulnerability. The guy that doesn't want to take direction from anybody that's associated with the government, somebody that's tied into all those conspiracy theories. But those theories have lasted for many years throughout the 90s. This debate played out also, you know, in the aftermath of Oklahoma City. We tell part of that story here in the museum as well. So I think it's a continual process to educate the public and to ensure law enforcement is communicating their priorities and working with community leaders. So it's a holistic event that gets to this strategy that I cite from Department of Homeland Security. The law enforcement and FBI and local law enforcement have done an excellent job on staying on top of that. But there's more work that can be done because we're not going to tamp down the ability for somebody to inspire somebody else to act. It's an endless proposition, I think. But I think we have made progress, and that's the point I wanted to make.
And I think, at least in my tenure at FBI, and I stepped down in July of last year, but I'm assuming that if anything, the efforts have continued to intensify. There was a renewed focus. There had always been a focus on it, but I think even a more intensified focus post-Charlottesville on this, and certainly a very important priority for Director Wray. With respect to the rhetoric and things that are said outside of the official sort of law enforcement channels, I would say that, as we alluded to before, there is the domestic agenda and the politics around a lot of these issues, and I don't see it having an impact on the FBI's focus on domestic terrorism. as I said, if anything, in my experience while I was there, I saw really them looking for ways to intensify their efforts and their partnerships, in particular with local law enforcement, to make sure that despite the restrictions on their abilities to meaningfully track a lot of these individuals, often until after the fact, that they were still doing everything within their power to stay focused and give this the emphasis that it needed.
So, Amanda, you have final comments. Are we going to wrap up?
I have final comments, which are, you two are amazing, and thank you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And I want to let people know we'll be doing another spy chat on March 19th with Michael Lacombe, not with Karen. He's got big shoes to fill, or red pumps to fill. So thank you all for being here very much.
But we're certainly going to bring Karen back for these programs. You know why she spoke here today. So thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.